Yo, I'm Broccoli Shavings. And you know what I like? Remakes. Today, I'm going to talk about a remake. Specifically, I want to talk about Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, the 2008 remake of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. You know, that one weird little game where the guy from Smash Bros. Doesn't wear any pants for some reason. Specifically, I want to focus on one aspect of the remake: the characters. See, whenever you remake a game, you gotta decide on how faithful of a representation you want to do. Do you just copy everything over exactly the same, or do you do some balance changes with nerfs and buffs? Fire Emblem, from the examples that we've seen so far, usually opt for either leaving units alone or giving them some buffs rather than nerfing them. But that said, there are some very notable exceptions to this that we can see in Shadow Dragon, with a few characters getting hit with a nerf. Hard. Let me go ahead and tell you, some of these nerfs that intelligent systems decided to dish out are just so severe that they just practically destroy any viability the character used to have. Like, they're that bad. Now, before we begin, I want to do a few quick disclaimers. I'll try to avoid situational nerfs. Like, Marth essentially stays the same across both games, but he's considerably worse in the remake, despite having basically the same stats. It just feels less like a nerf per se, and honestly, I'm just not very well educated on the Shadow Dragon meta, so I'm sure I'll miss out on something if I try looking into those. Oh, and growths actually change in Shadow Dragon based off of what class you're in, so I'll just be going off of the base classes for simplicity's sake. Also, as a general sort of thing, just about every unit got buffed in New Mystery of the Emblem, a remake of FE3 and the game right after Shadow Dragon. So most of these nerfs that I'm going to talk about today end up being compensated for in that game, so it usually just ends up working out just fine for the characters. Oh, yeah, I almost forgot. I should mention this. This entire video is going to be looking at growth rates, which I know, it's a very icky topic when talking about unit balance, but hear me out. From Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light to Shadow Dragon, unit bases stay the same, at least in their base class. So the main numerical difference between the two games is growth rates. So pretty please be accepting of the fact that I am just a casual little scrub that thought it'd be funny to talk about growth rates for a little bit. Anyways, enough of my yapping. Let's get into some really painful Shadow Dragon nerfs. Firstly, let's get some of the formalities out of the way. This is what I like to call units who were nerfed mostly because of modern approaches to class design, or were hit with a very hard nerf, but still have good enough stats to still be quite viable. The most obvious fit into this category is Navarre. See, back in FE1, there was no such thing as the Myrmidon class, so every sword user was just a mercenary. But as the games went on, the Myrmidon was a class established as a high-speed, low-powered sword user. And I guess when the remake came along, the developers over at Intelligent Systems decided that they needed to add some Myrmidons now, and that someone like Navarre was a great fit. And, I mean, looking at his past artworks, yeah, okay, that's a fair leap, I'll give it to him. But now you have to translate a unit that originally had a 50% growth in strength, 40% growth in skill, and 50% growth in speed into a Myrmidon. So, naturally, Navarre's strength got the axe, or sword, or whatever, going from a respectable 50% down to a more class-appropriate 30%. Oh wow, that's a big drop. What makes it kind of worse, though, is that his skill and speed weren't really buffed to reflect the class change, but, I mean, he's still decently fast for Shadow Dragon, so I'll give him that. A good example of a unit that got hit by a hard nerf but still stayed relevant would be Catria. In Shadow Dragon, she had a spread of 70% HP, 40% strength, 80% skill, and 80% speed. Now, as you can see, these growths are pretty dang high, especially towards the back end there. So, I guess for the sake of balance, Catria was hit with the Nerf Hammer, dropping down to 60% HP and 65% speed. Now, these growths are still very respectable, and Catria even gets a nice 5% buff to her strength growth as compensation. She also gets the Draco Knight promotion, which is just kinda stupid, so she ends up being just fine. Another unit that fits this hit by a hard nerf but still doing just fine for himself bill is Julian. Now, Julian in Shadow Dragon is just kind of funny, honestly. He's a thief that starts out pretty dang weak and can never promote, but he has some of the highest growths in the game, with 80% HP, 70% strength, 50% skill, and 50% speed. Now, like Katria, intelligent systems must have just decided that these numbers were too high and slashed his strength growth down to 50%. Ouch. But in all honesty, 50% strength is still very solid, and Julian's bases and his role as a thief make it so that his strength realistically isn't something that you care too much about. At most, we were robbed of a funny meme, but that's about it. Lastly, in this formalities category, I want to touch on Board and Cord. Now, these two goobers remain largely unchanged throughout all their appearances, but they did get one substantial nerf. Their defense growths went down from 50% and 40% respectively, down to freaking 10%. Like, wow, that's a big change. But in all honesty, it was likely due to a change in design philosophy for the fighters. In modern Fire Emblem design philosophy, fighters often have high HP, but mediocre to low defenses. So this change was likely made in order to more fit that model, especially since defense growths of 50 and 40% would be higher than all of your armored units. But still, man, did they really have to do that? This serves as a nice transition into the next category of nerfs. The ones that make you go, really? And to kick us off, we have the last of the Axe trio, Barst. Now, Barst, in his first couple of appearances, was easily your best Axe user. He had solid growths across the board, 60% HP, 50% strength, 50% skill, 50% speed, 50% defense, and even a nice 70% luck. Stat-wise, the man was a beast, staying more consistently strong than most of the army. His only real drawback was that fighters couldn't promote in FE1 and FE3, leaving him without any potentially helpful promotion bonuses. But overall, man was pretty dang good back in the day. And then Shadow Dragon came along and just absolutely gutted him, man. Literally all of his growths were nerfed, except for HP, which was actually buffed to 80%. But besides that, he now has 40% strength, 40% skill, 30% speed, 15% defense, and even 40% luck. They just went to town on this guy. Dang. I don't know what Barst did to make the developers over at Intelligent Systems so angry, but whatever it was enough to prompt them to take away literally everything that made him useful. He's weaker, slower, less bulky, and less accurate. Now, the only real solace here is that, despite my dramatics, Barst is somehow still pretty dang good in this game. He uses axes, which means he can use hammers and pole axes, which are effective weapons, which, if you don't know, are basically worth more than their weight in gold in the Shadow Dragon metagame. Also, while his growths are definitely worse, they're still oddly solid by Shadow Dragon standards, meaning that, along with his newfound ability to promote, Barst has the tools to remain relevant, despite Intelligent Systems' best efforts. Next up, we have Est. And Est is an odd case. See, her whole deal is that she shows up late at a low level, has low bases, but then makes up for it with good growths. Like, there's a whole archetype around the idea nowadays. But see, Est really does this the best. Not really, but just go with it. With an eye-popping 70% growth in strength, skill, and speed, complemented by a nice 50% growth in HP, 60% growth in luck, and 20% growth in defense. It can't all be winners, I guess. But see, as I kind of mentioned, Est kicked off an archetype of other similar late-joining unpromoted units with good growths. But their growths usually aren't as good as the original Ests, leaving them generally as average to pretty weak. So then along comes a remake, right? And now Intelligent Systems looks over at the most recent Ests with their growth rates, and then looks over at Est with her much higher growth rates, and are all like, well, we can't be having that now, can we? And then they just nerf her growths. Yeah, the unit whose whole point is having good growth rates gets her growths nerfed in the remake. Now she's down to 40% HP, 55% strength, 60% skill, 55% speed, 50% luck, and then 20% growth in defense. Well, at least they kept that one the same, yeah? But yeah, these growths are still fine, right? But they're nowhere near what Est used to be, or what you really want to see from a unit that joined so weak so late in the game. They done went and made Est a worse Est. Like, how do you do that? What? Now, next up on the nerfing block, we got Lind. Now, before we get into this, I should mention that magic is, weird in FE1 in that tomes will do set damage rather than go off of any of the user's stats. So most mages in the game just don't have a strength growth, but tomes were changed to going off of strength in FE3. So I'll be using those growths instead for ease of comparison. Now, the only big difference between FE1 and FE3 for Lind is that Lind's HP growth goes from 70% down to 40%, which is wow, but trust me, that's the least of our concerns right now. So, in FE3 now, Lind has an offensive growth spread of 20% strength, 70% skill, and 60% speed. It's pretty obvious from these growths that Lind is meant to be a speed mage, yeah? That's her role, that's her niche, that's her identity. But then we get to Shadow Dragon, and that just gets flipped straight on its head. Firstly, her skill gets nerfed down to 40%, which is just rude, by the way. But then her magic shoots up to 50%, and her speed falls down to 35%. And now, suddenly, Lind is a power mage. What? I mean, her base speed is fine, so she ends up being more well-rounded than anything, but what? Why would they do this? What's the point? I don't know if this really should be considered a full-blown nerf per se, but it's still a real head-scratcher. Why just suddenly up and reset Lind as a unit? Did they just not want a speed mage and wanted to at least give Lind something? And before anyone's like, oh, it's because she was a power mage compared to Merrick before. No, they were basically the same in FE3. So why is Lind suddenly different now? What? They just decided to nerf her speed for some reason, I guess. What? Now, on the topic of speed, we gotta talk about Rad, which is a name I definitely did not expect to see come up with this topic. For anyone not in the know, which don't worry, I don't blame you, Rad is a niche sort of meme character because he showed up in this one weird fanfiction that wrote him to be super duper cool or something. I really don't know the details, don't ask me. But the joke is that in Shadow Dragon, Rad is pretty, spoiler alert, bad. But if you go back about a decade or so and look at his first appearance in FE1, you'd find a different story. See, Rad is first and foremost a replacement character. He is a mercenary you get in Chapter 8 in case either Ogma or Navarre died. And as a replacement character, he's not really meant to be that good, since you're kinda getting punished for letting a unit die. And see, Rad, is better than you'd expect your average replacement character to be. He joins at level 1 with very low bases, yuck, but he has the highest growth rates of all your mercenaries, sporting 90% HP, 50% strength, 40% skill, and a whopping 70% speed. To put that speed growth in perspective, by the way, he's only outsped by Sheeta, Katria, and Tiki, and ties with Est. All units that are known for absurdly high speeds. Yeah, no biggie. So, yeah, in all, the original Rad starts off weak, but he's a growth unit with growths that are remarkably higher than your other mercenaries. He's not the best, but he has a role. But then Shadow Dragon comes along, and there are a few changes. Firstly, Rad, like Navarre, is switched from a mercenary to a Myrmidon. And this process of Myrmidonification takes its expected toll, with Rad's strength being cut from 50% down to 40%, and his bulk being slightly reduced, with his HP going from 90% to 80%. No surprises there, honestly. But then you look at his other stats, and you see that his skill got nerfed down to 35%, which, okay. And then his speed goes from 70% all the way down to 45%. What? They made this man a Myrmidon, and then they nerfed his speed into the ground? Dude, what? Why? they did him so dirty here, bro. They done broke his ankles, but like, not the funny way, like the actual way. They crippled this man. Now, I should mention, by the way, his bases are still the same. He's still a level 1 unit with really low bases, but now he just has no way to catch up. His entire, legacy as a unit has been tarnished because they took him from a decent growth project to just bad. There is nothing redeeming here. Why would they do this? Who does this benefit? Navarre? Did they just not want Rad to be better than Navarre? Is that what it is? I bet that's what it is. They're all like, oh, we can't let him be better than our edgy sword guy. We gotta knock him down a peg. It is insane what they did to this guy. Because it looks unprompted, right? He wasn't even that good back in the day. But keep in mind, Rad is supposed to be a replacement unit. And once they nerfed Navarre, Rad would have been just way better than him. He would have had a lot of advantages compared to Navarre. So they had to also nerf Rad because he's still supposed to be a replacement unit. So really, Rad here is a victim of circumstance, which is just crazy, man. Now, okay, the last unit I want to talk about here is kind of the reason I went down this whole rabbit hole, and that unit is Castor. See, Castor, as of time of writing, has just been released in Heroes, and from what I can see, a lot of the reception around him has either been lukewarm or not very appreciative of him. And I saw this and I was like, dang, I gotta defend bro's honor here, because truth be told, I freaking love Castor. He is one of my favorite bow users in Fire Emblem, if not my absolute favorite. But given his more recent appearances, it's pretty hard to see why I'd like him, and I think that's a shame. So humor me and allow me to take you through what the heck happened to Castor. Now, Castor, back in his early appearances in FE1 and FE3, was a frickin' stud, man. He had alright growths across the board, but there are 3 that I want to touch on specifically. He had 70% HP, 60% strength, and 40% speed. He was a power archer, which was honestly a bit more prevalent back in the day, but has since kind of gone out of style in favor of the skill speed archer. But honestly, I think they're kind of making a comeback with Etier and Engage, but that's besides the point. Anyways, apart from being part of a pretty interesting archetype, what makes Castor special is just how strong he really is. See, at 60%, Castor's strength growth is only topped by Julian and Est, and then ties with Fina once we get in FE3. All units that are designed to have absurdly high growth rates. And please just don't ask why a Thief and Dancer have some of the highest growths in the game. Kaga probably just thought it'd be funny. Anyways, this puts Castor's strength growth firmly in second place for both games, with everyone else having 50% or lower. He also joins in Chapter 2 with a respectable strength base of 7, meaning he starts hitting decently hard from the get-go and has plenty of time to contribute to the army and get even stronger. His speed ain't exactly the best with a growth of 40% and base of 6, but it's serviceable, and he could even realistically start doubling some slower enemies given some time. But speed's really not the point here. The point is that Castor is easily one of the strongest units in the entire game in terms of raw power, and personally, I just think that's incredible. Yo, editing shavings here, and I wanted to add a bit here. So really, I was thinking about Castor's stats, and I was like, dang, I wonder just how slow he is, because I remember him being quite good. And, it's been a while since I played FE1, so I decided to look up Castor's average level 20 speed stat, which ended up being 12. And I cross-referenced that with my own Castor speed, which was also 12. And I was like, oh, okay, mine was average. And then I decided to look at how doubling was calculated in FE1, and it's actually incredibly lenient, with you doubling as long as your attack speed is greater than your opponent's. And attack speed in this game is calculated by simply subtracting weapon weight from the unit's speed. So then I was like, oh, so how heavy are bows? And quite simply, they are very, very light. The standard bow has 1 weight, the bow gun 2, the steel bow and Parthia both have 3, and the silver bow is the heaviest at 6. So at this point, things were honestly looking up for our boy Castor here, right? But we really won't know unless we know how fast the enemies are. So I was like, okay, how fast are the enemies in this game? So I perused through Fire Emblem WoD, which, by the way, amazing site. And, okay, how do I put this? Castor at base speed, I'm talking like he didn't level up speed once. Man has 6 speed, right? Given the standard bow with its 1 weight, he doubles a considerable percentage of the entire enemy army. Like, looking through these maps, I cannot reasonably convey just how abysmally slow these enemies are, to the point that the number of enemies he doubles at base speed is only changed slightly when switching to the bow gun, and then reduced only by another small percentage by using a 3-weight bow. Put simply, Castor's speed is quite average, but enemy speeds are downright awful. So Castor will actually be doubling quite a lot for just about all of the game if you bring him along and just level him up. Is it with a silver bow? Heck, I was gonna say no, but if you level him up and he gets like average stats, you probably will find quite a few opportunities to double with the silver bow once Castor reaches the pretty low threshold to use it, admittedly. But, I mean, even using the cheap weapons, Castor has enough strength to deal some serious damage when he hits twice. Man, Power Archer may be a misnomer at this point, because this guy just doubles so much, he kind of betrays the idea of hit once for big damage. So full clarity, this next part is just examples of what I just said, but looking at certain maps. So you can just, like, skip this part if you want to get to the rest of the actual video instead of listening to me just, like, fanboying over how good Castor is. In which case, bye, enjoy the rest of the video. But if you're still here, thank you, and let's keep going. So just to drive this point home a little bit, let's look at some examples. Here's chapter 16 out of 25, so a little over halfway into the game. Here is my actual Castor that I used for that chapter at level 14. We'll only look at speed here, so ignore his blessed strength and suspiciously high weapon level. Although I will note that the average weapon level at this level is around 8, which gives Castor access to silver bows. Anyways, my Castor is incredibly speed screwed, about 3 points below average. But even he doubles all of these guys with a regular bow, these guys with a bow gun, and these guys with a steel bow, and I think there's even, like, one guy or maybe even a couple more that he doubles with a silver bow. I'll put up some damage calcs using average strength so my strength plus 1 doesn't skew the results, or maybe I won't because there's a lot of guys being doubled here. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I just wanted to clear that up because I feel like I gave off the impression that Castor is a unit that, like, rarely doubles, when in reality he doubles quite often, especially when he has, more than 6 speed, which I know I use that as an example, right? But fact of the matter is, with a growth like 40%, he's going to have more than base speed, which means he's doubling more often and with weapons that are stronger than a regular bow, which it's this paired with his raw strength that makes me think he's better than George in a lot of situations, but that's out of the scope for this video. Oh crap, the video. I wanted this whole Castor tangent. I almost forgot about the video. Man, I'm sorry. We should really be getting back to the video. Editing shavings out. His only real downside is that he can't promote in FE1. But hey, with every stat capping at 20, he's not really hurt all too bad by it, honestly. He also has a bad weapon level, but I mean, who else is going to use that manual, right? If not Castor. Like, just give it to Castor, please. Just give it to Castor, please. Do it. But we all know how this goes at this point. Shadow Dragon comes along and just ruins everything. They take Castor's HP growth down to a pitiful 40% and turn my 60-40 king into a 40-40 scrub. Yeah, they just took away his entire identity. Gone are the days of him having one of the highest strength growths in the game. In fact, he's not even a power archer anymore. He's just nobody now, and that's such a shame, man. He was a unique and fun unit before, but now there's no real reason to use him other than if you're someone like me who has an odd nostalgia for him. Now, I recognize that this is a bit of an anticlimax, but truth is, there's just not much more to say here. There's no interesting angle or layer to this. Castor's just worse now, plain and simple. But it is still a bit interesting, Because he's most definitely worse than he was before. We are not arguing that here. But he's not noticeably awful to anyone that doesn't know what he used to be. Like, let's be real here real quick, right? As much as I love the man, Castor went from like a niche bow user with one fun quirk to just a bow user. That's it. He's completely usable in Shadow Dragon, just, not at all notable. Like, he was nerfed enough to just absolutely destroy what made him interesting, but not enough to draw any real attention. And because of this, I feel like he suffers the worst fate possible for a unit in Fire Emblem. He's been forgotten. And really, that's just sad. But, I mean, at least Hero's got a stat spread right. And you bet I'm gonna be using this man. Why? Well, because he's Castor. When I look at him, I don't see the botched remake versions. I see, like, prime Castor. That was just so much fun to use. And I guess that's kind of the takeaway here. With the new age of Fire Emblem remakes, we're gonna see a lot more units in a lot of different ways in the coming years. And how we choose to remember these units may be cause for debate. Do we remember them at their best or their most recent? How do we determine this unit's legacy? And I know this ain't exactly an important question for the community as a whole, but it's something interesting to ask ourselves individually. This video sort of serves as a way to highlight that difference, to show that these two options of best or recent can be very different for some characters, and to make the case that we should always remember how units used to be as well. Because, as we've seen, intelligent systems can get kinda wild with that nerf hammer, and it's honestly just a shame to see a unit's entire identity just destroyed and then forgotten by the larger community. Now, I'm not telling you to do what I do and use DS Remake Castor because he used to be good many, many years ago, but what I am telling you is that units have a history, and as these new remakes come out, it's important to remember that history, lest we forget a unit's legacy. Thanks for watching.